He was once an action film icon, but he grew weary of the spotlight and escaped to an abandoned farm deep in a remote valley. Locals initially regarded him as a silent outsider, until ruthless corporations set their sights on the land. Unknown assailants crept in at night, sabotaging fences and irrigation systems to intimidate the lone farmer. Almost overnight, a tranquil valley found itself under siege by criminal tactics and veiled threats. A powerful tycoon and his relentless right-hand man were buying up properties, blocking farmers from their rightful access to water. Yet the former actor knew how to fight back, transforming the rundown farm into a clandestine stronghold. Others who refused to surrender joined him, believing that united, they could protect their homes. Now, it's not just about the fields, the lives of everyone who poured their hearts into this place hang in the balance. Day by day, tensions escalate, threatening to spark an all-out confrontation. But their plan relies not on firearms or violence, but on unity and a firm resolve to hold their ground, no matter the cost. He had once stood under the glaring lights of film sets and red carpet galas, forging a reputation as a relentless action icon recognized worldwide. Over time, however, the flash of cameras and the weight of never-ending demands had worn him down, leading him to abandon the life that had once defined him. His name was Jason Statham, though the rustic residents of Hollow Glen, an unassuming agricultural valley far from Hollywood's dazzle, knew him simply as a reserved newcomer with a lean, wiry build and a quiet demeanor. They watched him drive an old pickup truck down a dusty road each dawn, noticing his trimmed stubble and the distinct focus in his eyes. Few realized that those same eyes had once stared back at him from towering movie posters in city centers across the globe. Hollow Glen stretched across a fertile plain flanked by low, rolling hills. The land was known for its winding creeks and tall stands of sugar maples that turned into fiery mosaics in the fall. The few dozen families scattered around the valley had kept modest farms for generations. The region's main thoroughfare was a meandering county highway that led to a one-street town lined with a small diner, an outdated hardware store, and a feed shop that sold everything from plow parts to bales of hay. The local station occasionally played scratchy broadcasts of weather advisories and the county fair's announcements, sounding almost out of another era entirely. This unhurried rhythm was exactly what Jason sought when he first drove into town under a pale sunrise, towing behind him just enough belongings to fit into a single-story farmhouse he had purchased sight unseen. In his first week, he walked fields that had long been overgrown, left fallow by the previous owner's failing health. The soil was firm but not hopeless. He felt it between his fingers with deliberate care, as though weighing the new challenge he had set for himself. In the distance, the remnants of a barn stood askew, battered by years of harsh winds and neglect. An abandoned tractor rusted in the overgrown grasses near a sagging fence. Jason assessed each component the way he had once evaluated fight choreography, pinpointing weaknesses, anticipating improvements, and strategizing ways to get everything into shape. Day after day, he labored with single-minded dedication, clearing brambles, hauling debris, and marking out sections of land that held the greatest promise. In those quiet hours, he sometimes recalled memories of lavish movie premieres, echoing with photographers' shouts. Each recollection only steeled his resolve, reminding him why he had exchanged bright lights for the subdued hush of this neglected farm. The valley's older residents took note of the newcomer's relentless efforts. Certain neighbors quietly wondered about his background. He did not talk much about where he came from, and his lean physique suggested a lifetime of discipline they couldn't quite place. Some guessed he might have been involved in specialized military service. Others speculated that he had faced legal troubles, hence his desire for seclusion. A handful of curious onlookers tried to chat with him by the roadside, offering folksy conversation about the erratic rainfall or the rising cost of feed. He nodded politely but revealed little about himself. Over time, the rumors gave way to a sort of measured respect. He carried himself with unassuming confidence and rarely asked for assistance, though he occasionally offered to help others if he crossed paths with them at the feed store or near a broken fence. Hollow Glen was a place of tradition, yet it held a practical acceptance of newcomers who would put in an honest day's work. In these first months, Jason began to notice certain peculiarities in the valley. A large-scale corporation had established a foothold in the region, backing an irrigation project that seemed designed to siphon off water from smaller properties. This corporation was associated with a wealthy figure named Graham Fox, an absentee magnate who had quietly bought up farmland or forced local families to sell under veiled threats. Fox seldom visited in person, leaving most of the day-to-day intimidation to his well-paid intermediaries and the local enforcer who went by the name of Trent Chandler. From glimpses in town, Jason recognized Trent as a broad-shouldered man with a cold stare and a manner that commanded anxious compliance. Stories spread of mishandled property lines and carefully orchestrated events that allowed the corporation to claim people's water rights and farmland under layers of legal confusion. Late one afternoon, Jason was driving home after picking up supplies from the feed store when he noticed something off by the far edge of his fields. The mid-autumn sky was streaked with dim color, and a crisp wind swept the valley. He turned down the old dirt path and walked toward what looked like trampled wires and upturned soil near his half-repaired irrigation line. He inspected the damage. Sections of pipe had been ripped out, sprinklers lying twisted and disconnected. The footprints around the scene suggested at least a couple of intruders, given the overlapping impressions in the damp ground. He studied them for a moment, mentally cataloging each indentation in stride length. Many years ago, he had practiced a sort of on-the-spot situational awareness for his action roles, but back then it had all been for the camera. Here, under the fading light, there was a real sense of tension, something intangible that told him his presence in the valley might soon be challenged by forces beyond unspoken local rivalries. In the days that followed, Jason kept a low profile but sharpened his vigilance. He continued with repairs, using what materials he had left to patch the irrigation system. Each evening, he walked along the fence lines that divided his property from a neighboring estate rumored to be under Fox's silent ownership. The boundary was marked with old posts draped in coils of barbed wire. More than once, he saw vague silhouettes on horseback at a distance, surveying his land. He could not identify them, but the posture of those silent riders was anything but friendly or neutral. They rode off whenever he approached, vanishing behind trees or turning into a gravel road that led back to the bigger ranches. He suspected they were connected to Fox's operation, perhaps seeking to gauge whether the new farmer was someone they could intimidate. Each time, Jason felt a subdued spark of the controlled aggression he had wielded in his action hero days, but he made no obvious moves, preferring caution over confrontation. Still, tension slowly grew. There were veiled hints from the feed store manager about the fiasco of water rights that had escalated over the last several planting seasons. Some of the older farmers in Hollow Glen had lost entire acres to creeping acquisitions or questionable legal battles. At times, parcels of land would change hands in hush-hush deals that had the hallmark of corporate manipulation. New gates and high fences popped up where there had been open range for decades. Rumor had it that several families had abandoned their farms, pinned under mounting debt and overshadowed by unstoppable corporate pressure. Jason listened with careful, quiet interest to these accounts but gave no direct commentary. Although the townspeople did not quite grasp his past, they sensed his simmering resolve and a capability he had yet to reveal. On an overcast morning just before the rain set in, a battered truck arrived at Jason's property. Two men stepped out, scanning the structures with casual insolence. One was older, clad in a worn denim jacket, his graying hair slicked back. The other was younger, with a stance that indicated he believed intimidation came naturally to him. Jason watched their approach from a distance, standing near the old barn where he was reorganizing salvaged wood for future repairs. They gestured at the property boundaries and seemed to be talking with an authoritative air. He could see the older man occasionally nod in a direction that likely indicated the water lines. The younger man, arms folded, offered the occasional sardonic glance at the neglected state of the fields. Jason observed the entire exchange from the shadows, recalling film sequences in which antagonists surveyed a hero's lair. Only this time, it was not a script. Eventually, the pair climbed back into their truck and rumbled away, leaving behind fresh tire tracks in the mud and an unmistakable sense that bigger storms lay ahead. As autumn gave way to early winter, the rains arrived in earnest, saturating the valley's fertile soil and making every slope slick. Many of the older farmers welcomed the precipitation, seeing it as a chance for the land to recharge, especially after a summer marked by dryness and tension. Yet for Jason, each rainy morning was another test of endurance. He spent hours fortifying the barn roof, a patchwork of wooden planks and tarps that had to be nailed down. He hauled bags of concrete mix from town to fill the cracks in the aging foundation near the farmhouse. Mud clung to his boots, and the cold seeped into his bones, but he found a curious sense of renewal in these mundane tasks. The methodical routine helped keep his mind steady. Occasionally, echoes of cinematic illusions danced in his thoughts, a stunt sequence or a chase scene from past roles, yet the tangible strain of farm work felt more grounding than any action set had ever been. Each night, he fell onto his makeshift bed with an exhaustion that spoke to real accomplishment. One crisp evening, the clouds parted briefly, revealing a glowing half-moon above the valley. Jason took the opportunity to survey the fence lines. He moved with quiet purpose, stepping cautiously on the wet ground. In the silver moonlight, he spotted fresh evidence of tampering. Wire cutters had been used on the barbed wire, leaving sharp edges that glinted faintly. He stooped to examine the cuts and spotted footprints in the soaked soil, angled in a way that suggested a hurried retreat. At one point, he noticed a neatly folded paper pinned under a loose rock. It was a printed notice referencing property disputes, implying that his boundaries were in question. The wording read like a half-concealed warning rather than a formal document. He took it with him without reaction, determined to treat it as the clue it was meant to be. In that moment, the valley's quiet backdrop felt heavier, as though the centuries-old farmland itself waited to see how the conflict would unfold. The next few days brought an eerie calm. Fog hung over the valley's lowlands each morning, stretching across the meadows like a slow-moving tide. Jason continued his usual tasks but heightened his watchfulness. During a supply run into town, he caught glimpses of local faces that seemed uneasy. A few older farmers politely nodded at him, their expressions revealing unspoken worry. The manager of the hardware store, her gaze darting around, quietly informed him that the corporation's representatives were making visits to local properties again, claiming rights to water channels that many believed were part of a communal tradition. A hush spread whenever the name Fox came up in conversation. Jason recognized this pattern from the countless scripts he had read in another life, the looming, unseen antagonist orchestrating events through subordinates, pressing people into submission through a web of intimidation. Without letting on, Jason resolved to fortify his position. He reached out in the only subtle ways he knew, gathering small pieces of information about Fox and Chandler. Over multiple visits to the feed store, he casually mentioned farmland economics, gleaning from overheard fragments of conversation that Fox owned swathes of land well beyond Hollow Glen. Some was farmland that had been converted to mining prospects. Additional pieces were purchased purely for speculating on water resources. Chandler, it turned out, was the enforcer rumored to handle the dirty work, whether that meant bulldozing fences at night, undercutting irrigation lines, or fabricating legal claims to keep small owners entangled in confusion. While the locals had grown accustomed to abiding by Chandler's demands, they retained a flicker of resentment. Jason could sense that flicker brightening now, fueled by the rumor that a new landowner, a figure from somewhere beyond the valley, might stand up to corporate pressure. No one yet suspected his true background, but they recognized that he was not easily cowed. As winter progressed, the valley's weather turned erratic, alternating between frigid rains and unseasonably mild afternoons. Hollow Glen's wide farmland became a patchwork of puddles and muddy roads that challenged everyone's routines. Some farmers took the downtime to repair tools or rework machinery. Jason poured his energy into reinforcing his irrigation lines again, adopting a more robust design he had gleaned from reading agricultural guides. He stored extra fencing in the barn's loft and systematically reorganized the interior to create secure storage spaces for equipment. During these solitary tasks, he often recalled the discipline demanded by Hollywood sets, the intense training for physically demanding roles, the scrutinizing eyes of directors. Yet in the barn's dusty air, the only judge was necessity itself. A tense undercurrent began to ripple through the valley. Although no direct confrontation had occurred, subtle signs hinted that a storm was about to break. Horses' hoofprints appeared by the edges of certain properties, often near water sources. Small but telling acts of vandalism, broken gates, trampled hedges, surfaced around the farmland of those who publicly questioned Fox's claims. Word drifted through the diner that Chandler and a few of his men had been spotted scouting old logging roads that skirted the boundary of Jason's land. Despite efforts by some families to band together, there was a sense of resignation, a belief that the corporate reach was too extensive to counter. Meanwhile, Jason continued to perform his farm work with steady determination, ignoring the swirl of rumors. He knew from his old life that patience was a powerful asset and that each day of quiet preparedness might decide the outcome when the tipping point arrived. Late one night, well past dusk, Jason stood on his creaking porch, listening to the soft patter of leftover rain dripping from the barn's eaves. The moon remained hidden behind a heavy curtain of clouds. The entire valley felt cloaked in a hushed, waiting state. He sensed movement at the far edge of his property, near the patch of forest that blocked the wind from the northwest. The presence was faint, not more than a shift of shadows. Instinct urged him to remain still. He watched intently, picking up a distant sound that might have been hooves, accompanied by the faint jingle of tack. Then, as quickly as it came, it faded away. Once again, he was left with the impression that watchers had come to gauge the readiness of the newcomer in the worn farmhouse. They likely rode away with no answers, only the knowledge that he stood alert at this late hour. He considered that a small victory. As the night deepened, Jason walked the perimeter of the yard, ensuring the gates were latched and the equipment locked. A part of him reflected on how ordinary yet how vital these steps felt compared to the choreographed illusions he had once performed on camera. The struggles here carried no promise of glamour or box office triumph. Each risk was personal, and the stakes were tangible, measured in the ownership of land and the security of people's livelihoods. Despite the tension, he felt an undercurrent of satisfaction, as if forging a sense of purpose that had eluded him throughout his years under the bright lights. He was no longer stepping into a role to be shot from multiple angles, he was quietly writing his own script. And if an inevitable confrontation loomed, he intended to face it on his own terms. In the days that followed, the valley's hush felt deeper than usual, as if every living thing anticipated a shift in the landscape. Jason awoke each morning to the pale gray sky of late winter and committed himself to tasks that had become steady anchors in his new routine. He devoted extra hours to shoring up the barn's roof, weaving a tarp carefully among weathered beams to catch stray drips of melted frost. He honed his focus on smaller improvements as well, reinforcing the farmhouse's windowsills with fresh caulk to keep out the drafts that rode in on fierce gusts. While he worked, his mind played through countless scenarios, the possibility of intimidation tactics returning in the night, the sudden appearance of strangers with claims to his property lines, and the subtle manipulations of men like Chandler. There remained no clarity as to when or how an open confrontation might materialize, but he felt it in the crisp air that such a moment was unavoidable. On occasion, the gloom broke, and the early afternoon sun briefly lit the valley with a softened radiance. Around midday, Jason sometimes rested, standing near the farmhouse porch to watch crows circle overhead and farmland stretch toward the hazy tree line. At those times, he sensed a fragile serenity in Hollow Glen. Despite everything he suspected about the corporation's schemes, the land itself exuded a quiet power. This place had weathered countless cycles of nature and human ambition. Jason resolved to treat it with the respect it deserved, though he also felt certain that the valley's unspoken rules did not apply to those who trampled over tradition in pursuit of profit. He gradually became more familiar with the farmland's contours. He discovered a narrow creek hidden behind a thicket of brambles at the southeastern boundary. The creek's current was gentle, yet it curved in such a way that made it a potential secondary source of water, one the corporation had not yet seized under official claims. Jason took note of each bend and planned to clear the overgrowth once winter loosened its grip. Another day, while patrolling the northern stretch of his property, he noticed the remains of a primitive irrigation ditch that must have been carved out decades ago, perhaps abandoned when new technology arrived. He saw signs that local wildlife had used it for shelter and nesting, and he left it undisturbed for the time being. These small discoveries deepened his appreciation for the land's hidden possibilities. Word of Jason's presence soon spread beyond the immediate cluster of neighboring farms. Now and then, a truck would trundle up his long dirt driveway, carrying a cautious but curious local. Some came to inquire about the potential sale of scrap metal from the old tractor in his field, or to see if he might want to swap fencing materials or leftover spare parts. Though Jason spoke little about his past, he used these interactions to observe the shifting alliances in Hollow Glen. He discovered that a handful of families had quietly pooled their resources to resist threats from Fox's operation. They did so discreetly, exchanging borrowed machinery and offering one another safe storage for goods. Others, less trusting, had chosen to remain distant or had accepted small payoffs, forging uneasy truces with Chandler's men. Jason perceived an intricate web of cooperation and disunity, and he recognized that if a larger conflict erupted, these underlying fractures could determine who stood together. During one of his supply trips to the feed store, he noticed more definite signs of that fracture. Trucks pulled in and out of the muddy parking lot, their drivers huddling in tense clusters near the entrance. Jason, stepping inside for a sack of livestock feed and a fresh spool of fence wire, sensed that an argument had been simmering. A pair of older farmers, their faces etched with concern, exchanged wary glances as a younger, clean-cut man in a pressed jacket handed out brochures advertising a new development. The pages showcased images of renovated barns and promises of modern irrigation systems. While no one raised their voice, the atmosphere bristled with suspicion. Jason recognized that the brochures, emblazoned with a corporate logo, represented Fox's creeping influence disguised in a veneer of progress. Several farmers took the pamphlets only to set them aside with a scoff. Others carried them away with narrowed eyes, uncertain whether to feel hope or wariness. Jason left without comment, though a few recognized him and watched him go, perhaps wondering which side he might eventually choose. As the days lengthened, subtle hints of spring emerged. The mornings were still cool, but a faint warmth in the air suggested that winter's hold was not unbreakable. Small shoots of wild grass peeked through the thinning snow, while tree buds in the distance formed a pale green haze against the horizon. Jason turned his attention toward planning the first real planting on his land. He tested sections of soil with a simple kit purchased at the hardware store, gauging the pH level and mineral balance. He found that certain fields, especially those closer to the barn, boasted especially fertile soil, suitable for root vegetables and hardy grains. The outer reaches, still riddled with invasive weeds, showed more erratic results. He took notes and set aside a portion of his savings to invest in quality seeds, though he remained mindful that an open conflict with corporate aggressors could undermine all his efforts. Farming, he realized, demanded both an embrace of the land's unpredictability and a willingness to contend with human machinations beyond the horizon. Signs of that looming confrontation persisted. A local woman who ran a small apiary at the edge of the valley visited Jason's property late one afternoon, seeking help to move a few heavy beehive boxes to higher ground before the thaw brought flooding. She explained that in the previous season, she had been forced to shift her entire operation when new fences blocked access to the old path near a communal water source. An official letter from Fox's corporate offices had claimed those routes as restricted property, although generations of farmers had used them without issue. While she recounted her struggles, her expression reflected a quiet resignation. Jason loaded his pickup with the beehive boxes, climbed behind the wheel, and followed her to a safer area near her orchard. Later, once everything was secured, she offered him a modest batch of honey in thanks, which he accepted with a nod. Though neither spoke directly of an alliance, both recognized that they were bound by a shared need for independence from outside interference. Through further cautious exchanges with local families, Jason learned that Chandler had begun summoning landowners to perfunctory meetings at an old warehouse situated on property rumored to have been seized under murky circumstances. Supposedly, these sessions revolved around clarifying water rights and finalizing agreements to route irrigation away from smaller plots of land in favor of large-scale operations championed by Fox. Men who attended often emerged deflated, forced to sign papers that extended corporate control or risk immediate eviction. A few tried to band together, but the threat of legal action or worse seemed to hang over them. One elderly farmer, known for his skill in breeding draft horses, had reportedly refused to sign, only to find his farmland suddenly inundated with muddy runoff redirected from a neighboring estate. His livestock fell ill, and he could do little more than spend precious funds to drain the swamp that had been inflicted upon him. Jason stored these accounts in his memory. The pattern echoed some of the more insidious scripts he had come across during his Hollywood tenure, where greed and corruption lay beneath polished veneers. This time, no director was calling, cut, and the stakes were the livelihoods of real people. He took small steps in response. Fortifying his own irrigation lines with secure valves and hidden shutoffs, ensuring that any attempt at sabotage might be met with swift countermeasures. He reclaimed broken fence posts from an abandoned lot nearby, reinforcing weaker sections of his boundary line. Although he had no illusions that a bit of barbed wire would hold off determined enforcers, these measures at least erected a first layer of defense. Meanwhile, he maintained a polite, neutral demeanor whenever he drove into town, never hinting at the internal vigilance that guided his every move. The start of spring advanced with light rainfall. On many afternoons, a fine drizzle settled over the valley like a translucent veil. The fields slowly exchanged their brownish hue for subtle greens, and orchard owners prepared for the delicate blossom season. Along the county highway, tall maples began showcasing tiny leaves, a harbinger of the color that would later sweep across them. Hollow Glen felt poised at the threshold of renewal, yet an undercurrent of anxiety remained. The corporation's radio silence, at least toward Jason, struck him as ominous, as though they were preparing a more strategic move rather than simply giving up. He continued to spot horsemen surveying from the tree lines. On 2 occasions, he saw a black SUV creeping along a ridge road at dusk, its tinted windows obscuring whoever might be watching. Still, no open confrontation arrived, and the local rumor mill was quieter than usual, suggesting that Chandler's tactics might be unfolding behind closed doors. In the midst of this tense lull, a minor incident in town drew attention. The feed store, a lifeline for many farmers, was vandalized overnight. Someone had splashed paint across the doors and windows, leaving behind a crude message about selling worthless seed and betraying real progress. The owner, a reserved older man who prided himself on offering fair prices, was visibly shaken. Locals gathered in small groups outside the store that morning, muttering theories about the perpetrators. Some pointed fingers at the corporation's supporters, suspecting an attempt to sow discord or to punish the store owner for assisting struggling farmers. Others thought it might be the work of troublemakers with no affiliation, simply seeking to exploit rising tensions. Jason stood at a distance, calmly surveying the dismay and frustration etched onto weary faces. The store had long been a neutral ground in the valley. Seeing it targeted in such a brazen manner hinted that the balance of power had shifted, and not in favor of peaceful resolution. In the following week, the sense of quiet siege intensified. Letters appeared in mailboxes across Hollow Glen, composed of dense, legal-sounding jargon about land reassessments and irrigation management. Hand-delivered copies found their way to front doors, though nobody witnessed who had dropped them off. Families began to speak more openly of leaving the valley rather than risking a more devastating confrontation with corporate muscle. Some had relatives in distant cities and believed that the modest sums offered by Fox to vacate their land might at least help them start anew. Others clung to a desperate sense of pride, declaring among themselves, though seldom out loud in public, that they would die before surrendering the farms their grandparents had tended. Once again, Jason took this all in quietly. He detected in certain individuals a resolve that matched or surpassed his own, a refusal to break even under immense pressure. That quiet solidarity swayed him more than any outward show of defiance might have. He realized that, despite the isolation he'd initially sought, he now felt responsible in some measure for the valley's fate. A day of scattered rain showers gave way to a startlingly clear dawn. Jason rose early, stepping out to a scene of shimmering dew across every surface. He loaded his truck with hand tools and drove toward a field near the orchard he had visited before, where the beekeeper had requested assistance clearing invasive brush. The road wound through a gentle slope, passing farmland dotted with grazing animals that seemed to roam more freely now that the snow had melted. He reached the orchard and spent the next few hours hacking away at brambles and lifting rocks to clear a future patch for additional beehives. The orchard owner arrived midway through to offer a container of warm tea and to relay an unsettling tidbit. Rumors circulated that Fox himself might visit the region soon, accompanied by legal advisors. The orchard owner heard it through a relative who worked at a law firm in the nearest city. If true, it meant that everything was set to escalate, an arrival of the puppet master to finalize control or snuff out any resistance once and for all. Jason listened, offered thanks for the tea, and resumed work without betraying the complicated mixture of vigilance and apprehension that churned inside him. He completed the brush clearing late in the afternoon and drove back along the gravel roads, noticing that the day's sun had coaxed more green shoots from the land, even where the soil was compacted. Back at his farmhouse, he stood for a while, scanning the horizon. He thought of all that he had walked away from in the city of perpetual headlines and glitzy events. Ironically, here in this rural stretch, the stakes felt more genuine and pressing than any public spotlight. He considered preparing certain fallback plans, though what shape those might take was not entirely clear. He had no illusions that a single individual could outmaneuver an entire corporate apparatus, yet he knew what it meant to fight relentlessly once a cause was deemed worthy. Mid-spring brought warmer breezes and the start of planting season. Tractors rumbled on the roads, hauling seed drills and plows. Early mornings were filled with the aroma of freshly turned soil. While the farmland came alive with bustling activity, tension still lurked beneath the surface. Each local greeted neighbors with a mindful courtesy, aware that any careless word might find its way to unsympathetic ears. Here and there, pockets of farmland displayed brand new infrastructure, presumably financed by Fox's corporation, showcasing modernized irrigation pipes gleaming in the sun. These changes were touted as signs of progress, yet they remained overshadowed by the knowledge that many families had only acquiesced out of financial desperation or fear of retribution. Jason refocused his efforts on his own fields, where the earth had softened just enough to allow for planting. He had secured seeds for hardy vegetables and a variety of grains suitable for the valley's climate. He repaired his harrow and carefully tilled a rectangular plot behind the barn, guided by the knowledge gleaned from the soil tests. The rhythmic process of turning the soil, laying down seeds, and watering them in measured intervals was almost meditative for him. The repeated tasks chiseled into his mind a sense of forward momentum, despite the precarious situation that surrounded him. He found satisfaction in the simple truth that a field planted with care might yield sustenance for himself and perhaps for neighbors in need, no matter what might unfold on the broader stage. During this planting period, a pair of local ranchers, brothers who raised cattle on a stretch of rolling pasture, stopped by to share news of renewed pressure from Chandler's Circle. They reported that certain gates along the shared creek had been locked shut without warning, cutting off their animals' access to water. Though they had appealed to the local county office, they received only circuitous statements about boundary disputes and missing paperwork. Jason accompanied the brothers to the site, examining the locks and the newly posted signs forbidding trespassing. The signage bore the insignia of a shell corporation widely rumored to be under Fox's umbrella. The ranchers were uncertain how to fight back, since the paperwork behind these maneuvers was labyrinthine and the local authorities seemed disinclined to challenge corporate claims. Jason offered measured suggestions, such as gathering photographic evidence and reaching out to any sympathetic local officials. He also mentioned an alternate approach that bypassed the fenced creek, though it would require extra labor and resources to pump water from a secondary stream. The brothers were grateful for the ideas, even if their expressions betrayed the exhaustion of men battling a conflict that felt both endless and unjust. Some weeks passed in this uneasy balance of cautious farming and simmering tensions. The orchard blossoms arrived in pastel colors, lending a fleeting beauty to the valley. Fresh green leaves now draped the maples, which had begun to sway with a gentle rustling whenever the wind picked up. Lambs frolicked in fields, and newborn calves wobbled alongside watchful mothers. If one viewed Hollow Glen from afar, it looked a picture of pastoral tranquility, ripe for postcards and tourist brochures. Yet those who lived here understood the turmoil beneath the surface. The sense of living on borrowed time intensified with each rumor that Graham Fox would soon appear in person. Then, on a mild morning in late spring, the atmosphere changed abruptly. A column of dusty vehicles sped through the valley's main thoroughfare, heading in the direction of one of Fox's large properties. Several SUVs with dark-tinted windows led the caravan, followed by trucks bristling with unfamiliar equipment. Locals paused in their tasks to watch the procession, exchanging guarded looks. Jason happened to be driving into town for supplies and saw the convoy pass. He parked his truck at the feed store and, with a discreet vantage point, observed the direction in which they disappeared. He sensed that the final stage of the corporation's campaign was underway, though whether it would culminate in an overt standoff or another wave of veiled legal maneuvers remained uncertain. That afternoon, as Jason loaded fertilizer and spare tractor parts into his truck bed, the store manager approached him cautiously. She mentioned hearing that Fox's representatives intended to convene a large meeting of local landowners at the county building in a week's time, ostensibly to present a comprehensive land use proposal that would define the region's future. Attendance might be mandated in order to dispute any corporate claims. Jason offered a silent nod, acknowledging that this was the moment so many had dreaded. He drove home along winding roads, passing homesteads where a handful of resolute families worked their land. Inside the truck, a swirl of memories from his old life vied with the pressing reality of the present. He recognized the shape of events that led toward a dramatic climax, with lines drawn and choices demanded. The difference here was that no camera crew would call it a wrap, and the outcome would reverberate in livelihoods rather than box office returns. The lead-up to the scheduled gathering became a slow burn of unease that settled over the valley like a storm cloud refusing to break. Hollow Glen's residents carried on with their spring tasks, tending fields and orchards, yet conversations inevitably circled back to the rumor that a definitive proposal would soon be placed before them. Jason went about his work in the long rectangular plot behind his barn, where delicate shoots of grain began to appear, forming green lines that would soon flourish if uninterrupted. He often paused to look across his land, noticing how the fences and irrigation channels he had reinforced over the past weeks remained intact. Nobody had tested their resilience just yet, though he remained confident that any attempts to sabotage his progress would not surprise him a second time. He sensed an undercurrent of urgency guiding his day-to-day actions, as if everything he did now had to be completed quickly, lest circumstances spin out of control after the meeting. He stored away extra tools in locked chests and organized his supplies with meticulous care, recalling scenes from past film sets where attention to small details could mean the difference between success and chaos. Here, the stakes were more tangible than in any scripted production. A single error could cost not only his harvest but also the land itself, and he knew that his personal conflict with corporate aggressors mirrored the hardships of many neighbors who had fewer resources and no illusions about outside help. In the days leading up to the event, the roads near the county seat became unexpectedly busy. Sedans bearing out-of-state license plates glided through Hollow Glen, carrying individuals who discreetly snapped photos of farmland or consulted documents while parked at the roadside. Black SUVs made repeated circuits around the area, occasionally stopping in front of gates leading to properties still engaged in boundary disputes. A small group of men in matching jackets, likely Fox's legal or administrative aides, were spotted conversing near the diner with local officials. By all accounts, they were conducting final assessments or possibly setting up the logistics for the meeting. Residents saw them conferring in low tones, their expressions a mixture of efficiency and concealed resolve. The orchard owner, grateful for Jason's help with the beehives, quietly relayed a brief conversation overheard at the post office. A county clerk had mentioned that Fox's corporation intended to present new evidence justifying water reallocation. Supposedly, these documents would depict a modern blueprint for irrigation canals, bigger storage tanks, and improved drainage. Yet in practice, the plan would channel the region's resources toward a handful of large plots, leaving smaller holdings reliant on permission or rental fees. The orchard owner worried that once official papers were filed, immediate land acquisitions would follow, and those who refused to sell or vacate might find themselves embroiled in lawsuits they could not afford to contest. Jason listened intently, his jaw set, aware that the orchard owner was far from the only local bracing for a hammer strike. The entire valley seemed on edge, each farmer wondering whether to attend the county meeting or keep a low profile, even if that meant surrendering by default. A hint of confrontation appeared at dusk one evening, just a few days before the gathering. Jason had loaded the last of his equipment into his truck after a day spent repairing a damaged ditch beyond the northern fence line. The sky glowed with the amber shades of an extended sunset, and a gentle breeze rustled the emerging leaves in the surrounding trees. As he drove back toward the farmhouse, the shape of a vehicle parked along his driveway caught his eye. It was a truck he did not recognize, its headlights off, angled as though waiting in ambush. He slowed his approach, adrenaline heightening his senses. The memory of an action thriller set flickered briefly, but he pushed it aside. This was reality, and he needed to read the situation clearly. He parked several yards away, left the engine idling for a moment, then switched it off and stepped out. The truck ahead remained silent, its windows too tinted to see who might be inside. After a tense interval, the engine abruptly roared to life. The driver lurched forward, tires kicking up gravel, and sped past him along the narrow road, cutting too close to Jason's vehicle as if in provocation. Jason caught a glimpse of the driver's silhouette, broad-shouldered and wearing what appeared to be a bald cap. The figure did not slow or stop, disappearing into the deepening shadows beyond. Once the dust settled, Jason carefully checked his property. Nothing obvious seemed amiss, but fresh tire tracks in the mud led to a spot near the fence where he had stacked some recovered metal scraps. It looked as though the driver had surveyed the place, possibly hoping to steal something or leave behind a warning. Jason felt that familiar pang of caution as he scanned the grounds. It could have been a petty trespass or a sign that intimidation was escalating. The next morning arrived in a pastel wash of sunlight filtering through thin clouds. Jason rose early to continue chores and gauge whether any further disturbances had occurred overnight. His barn and outbuildings appeared undisturbed, and no suspicious tracks marred the driveway beyond those from the previous evening. He took some comfort in that, though he remained certain the tension would not simply fade. His neighbors, or at least those who had mustered the courage to talk openly, described similar episodes of loitering vehicles or riders on horseback emerging at the edges of their land. None of these incidents had turned violent, but they added a strain to every waking moment, as if someone were testing boundaries and watching for vulnerabilities. In the final days before the scheduled county assembly, Hollow Glen buzzed with rumors about who might attend and who would stand in open defiance. Some older farmers insisted they would show up to confront Fox and his associates face to face, while others vowed not to give the meeting any semblance of legitimacy by participating. A few quietly prepared relocation plans in case the outcome spelled doom for small-scale landowners. Jason spent these days finalizing his farm tasks, ensuring that if he had to leave for a few hours, or even a few days, his fledgling crops would not suffer. He kept a keen eye on water channels and made sure the mechanical pump he had acquired was locked tight in the barn. Each evening, he reflected on how different this life was from the one he had once lived under perpetual spotlights. Yet in some ways, the core challenge was unchanged, to remain resolute under mounting pressure and to channel his disciplined focus into every decision. On the day of the county meeting, the sky brooded with sullen clouds, occasionally breaking to let shafts of sunlight flicker across the farmland. Jason drove into town, noticing a line of pickups and cars filling the usually sparse parking areas. Dozens of locals stood about the sidewalks, some scanning the horizon for signs of arriving corporate representatives, others in hushed conversations about property taxes and water rights. The county building itself was an unadorned two-story structure of aged brick, its narrow windows reminiscent of older civic architecture. A modest lawn stretched in front, with a flagpole lacking any flag on that particular day. A sense of portent hung over the scene as farmers, ranchers, and orchard keepers filed inside. Jason joined the crowd, entering a long hallway that led to an assembly room at the building's far end. He saw no familiar faces from his past life, only the wary and weathered visages of those who relied on the land for survival. He recognized a few neighbors from casual encounters at the hardware store. They nodded briefly, likely relieved to see him there, although nobody dared speak above a murmur, aware that corporate affiliates might be present at any corner. Closer to the door of the assembly room, a small desk had been set up with sign-in sheets and name tags. He scribbled his name discreetly, declining to fill out any optional personal information. An older clerk gave him a fleeting look but did not press the issue. Inside, rows of folding chairs had been arranged before a low stage. A handful of county officials stood near a table to one side, shuffling papers and conferring in whispers. At the front, a large easel displayed what looked like a map of the valley, color-coded with new lines indicating proposed irrigation routes and reservoir expansions. Jason settled into a chair near the back, observing the tension in the room. Some attendees clutched worn binders filled with property deeds or other documents they hoped to present as evidence of their rights. Others sat empty-handed, arms folded in a resigned posture. The orchard owner was present, scanning the room with an expression of apprehension that turned briefly to relief upon spotting Jason. A few minutes later, the door opened, drawing everyone's attention. A small group entered, led by a man with a composed bearing and neatly trimmed hair. He wore an expensive-looking suit and carried a thin briefcase. Behind him strode two other men of similarly polished appearance, though their suits were less finely tailored. Trailing them was a figure Jason recognized from rumors and vague descriptions, Trent Chandler, the enforcer rumored to handle Fox's unsavory directives. Chandler stood out with his athletic build and a gait that suggested readiness for confrontation at any moment. In one fluid motion, he surveyed the room, his eyes narrowing as if cataloging each face. He spared a cursory glance at Jason but did not linger, apparently weighing the mix of people present without singling anyone out. The suited man at the front placed his briefcase on a wooden podium. After tapping a microphone attached there, he began addressing the assembled group in a carefully moderated tone. While he spoke in measured sentences about opportunities, progress, and improved infrastructures, his words carried the underlying note of an ultimatum. His colleagues pointed at the displayed map, highlighting new canals and reservoir sites, all of which converged on a handful of centralized points. Jason observed that these strategic nodes would fall under corporate oversight, effectively controlling the flow of water to smaller parcels. County officials, seated to one side, wore forced expressions, nodding at intervals but offering little indication of support or dissent. The orchard owner clenched her jaw, occasionally passing a pointed glance at Jason. The entire performance had the feel of a meticulously rehearsed production. After the man finished his overview, one of the county officials made a gesture that signaled a brief recess, possibly to allow people time to study the diagrams and voice questions. The attendees shifted uneasily, some standing up to stretch, others stepping to the front for a closer look at the map. Jason remained seated, dissecting the presentation in his thoughts. There was no direct mention of forced buyouts or property seizures, instead, the language stressed optional cooperation. Yet anyone versed in the valley's struggles could read between the lines. If the corporation possessed the rights to those new reservoir sites, they could throttle access or impose steep fees on uncooperative landowners. It was precisely the scenario that had eroded trust in the region, repackaged under bright graphics and legal disclaimers. At that juncture, Chandler moved away from the podium area, drifting through the crowd as though he intended to mingle. He barely spoke, yet his presence garnered tension in every corner he approached. People either stepped aside or fell silent under his glance. He stopped occasionally to listen to a snippet of private conversation and then continued. Jason watched him with guarded interest, recalling scenes from old film plots in which an antagonist surveyed the terrain before striking. Here, the friction was real, the fear on people's faces genuine. Chandler's slow circuit eventually brought him near Jason, and for an uncomfortable beat, the two men locked eyes. Chandler studied him as though appraising a potential threat or ally, but he offered no sign of recognition. After a moment, he moved on, leaving in his wake a wave of relieved exhalations from neighbors who did not want to attract scrutiny. When the meeting reconvened, a county official wearing thick glasses read out a list of property owners who would be most affected by the proposed changes. The official explained that each landowner could claim a consultation period to negotiate adjustments if they felt their acreage would be unfairly impacted. However, the timeline was short, and if no agreement was reached, the plans could proceed without further debate. A ripple of anxiety pulsed through the room. Jason scanned the list, recognizing the orchard owner's name and that of the beekeeping neighbor. His own was absent from the initial group, possibly because he was still relatively new to the region. That might grant him a temporary reprieve, though he knew better than to assume he was safe from the corporation's broader objectives. The next portion of the presentation introduced a well-dressed man who unfurled large sheets detailing projected economic gains from consolidated water management. He used terms like long-term viability, strategic alignment, and sustainability compliance, which sounded alluring but contained no reference to the experiences of families who had farmed these lands for generations. Those in attendance grew restless, some exchanging uneasy glances, others slumping in chairs. Jason remained outwardly composed while formulating a mental map of the scenario. The corporation was effectively capturing the region's future by controlling a resource it had long coveted. Legal complexities would bind each landowner, turning them into tenants under Fox's brand of progress. Once these changes were locked in, reversing them would be monumental, requiring resources and support the locals did not have. By the session's conclusion, the tension in the room was palpable. Nobody erupted in a dramatic protest, no shouts or accusations disturbed the formal setting. Yet a hushed despondency settled like heavy fog. People understood that they had just witnessed the unveiling of a plan whose roots ran much deeper than any single meeting. As the attendees trickled out, the corporate entourage remained near the front, exchanging hushed words with county officials. Jason lingered at the back, watching the orchard owner, the beekeeping neighbor, and a few other landholders drift toward the exits, their faces etched with worry. Chandler idled by one wall, arms folded, scanning the thinning crowd with an inscrutable air. Before leaving, Jason surveyed the large map displayed on its easel. The bright lines and arrows, combined with carefully worded labels, exuded a sense of imposed inevitability. The entire valley was carved into zones of probable corporate dominion. For a fleeting moment, he recalled a film scene in which he had portrayed a renegade determined to protect a small town from a powerful syndicate. But this was no script, and the overshadowing force now bore the weight of real corporate law. He resolved not to let that memory distract him. Instead, he would harness the discipline he had developed through years of rigorous preparation on and off camera. Stepping out into the corridor, he pressed forward with a firm stride, understanding that the days ahead would demand more than quiet diligence. They would require a willingness to act, even if doing so meant confronting a system larger than anything he had battled before. The aftermath of the county meeting rippled through Hollow Glen like a slow-moving tempest, its edges trailing a sense of finality that neither side could ignore. Over the next few days, landowners pored over the documents they had been handed, struggling to interpret the impenetrable legal language that outlined new water routes and reservoir easements. County officials accepted walk-in consultations at sporadic intervals, and local families lined hallways in anxious silence, waiting to hear whether their land would be deemed suitable for corporate retention or if an alternate arrangement might spare them the burden of immediate buyouts. Many left clutching more papers and disclaimers, eyes dulled by the realization that any path forward would require unmanageable time, money, and expertise. Jason returned to his farm and took stock of the tension simmering beneath the valley's appearance of normalcy. Small signs betrayed the anxiety gripping every corner. The feed store operated with shortened hours, as if bracing for conflict. The orchard owner taped cardboard over the windows of her equipment shed, wary of the vandalism that had struck others who refused to cooperate. The local diner, once a place of modest conviviality, now hosted patrons who spoke in tight whispers, scanning the entrance whenever a stranger passed by. Even the children who played near the gravel roads were less boisterous, sensing that the adults moved with an unspoken weight on their shoulders. A hush settled over the farmland, as though the valley itself was holding its breath, anticipating a decisive moment. In the ensuing week, official notices arrived at various properties. At first, the orchard owner discovered a folded paper slipped beneath her door, referencing an upcoming reclassification of her water rights based on the newly proposed reservoir expansions. A day later, the beekeeping neighbor reported finding a similarly worded statement posted at her gate, effectively limiting her independent access to certain routes she had used for years. Others received final calls to appear at so-called mediation sessions, where corporate representatives could present reasonable terms. Through it all, Fox remained an elusive presence in the background, glimpsed only by a few who claimed to have seen a sleek sedan carrying him down dusty roads at odd hours. Trent Chandler, on the other hand, grew more visible, driving around the valley in a black SUV or appearing at local offices with carefully folded documents. Jason spent his days in what felt like heightened vigilance, dividing his time between routine farm tasks and strategic preparations. He inspected his fences daily, ensuring the barbed wire was intact and scanning for telltale footprints. He deepened certain irrigation trenches, using the terrain to his advantage should someone decide to trespass in force. He cleared out an old storeroom in the barn, reorganizing his supply of spare parts so that he could quickly manage repairs if any sabotage occurred. None of this was guaranteed to deter the juggernaut of corporate legal power, but it at least gave him a sense of self-reliance he refused to yield. Each evening, he felt the burden of a countdown, as if the valley's future was balancing on a razor's edge, waiting for a single event to tip it one way or another. One quiet afternoon, an unexpected storm gathered in the west, bringing a sudden deluge that drenched the fields and stirred the creek beds to life. Rain swept across Hollow Glen in silvery sheets, blurring the outlines of barns and bludgeoning the newly blossomed wildflowers. Jason watched from his farmhouse window, tracking rivulets of water that raced through the channels he had dug. Trees bent under gusts, and thunder rolled across the sky, echoing through the hills. For a moment, the entire valley lay under nature's command, the corporate designs and property disputes rendered inconsequential by the raw force of wind and rainfall. When the storm finally passed, leaving behind a world of dripping eaves and washed-out tracks, a strange clarity settled in Jason's mind. He recognized that the intangible storms within the community were about to coalesce into something equally forceful and inescapable. A few days later, a rumor spread that Fox and his core team would meet on a particularly large ranch at the far edge of Hollow Glen to finalize water allocation details. Several local families had been summoned, and some would use the occasion to sign the agreements, effectively trading autonomy for a short-term sense of security. Others, less willing to concede, planned to confront the corporation's emissaries face to face. The orchard owner confided that she had received an order to present her final decision that very evening. She intended to make a stand, hoping to rally support from neighbors, though she admitted that her orchard faced certain ruin if the reservoir expansions proceeded unchecked. The beekeeping neighbor, equally distressed, announced that her hives were already struggling from restricted access to critical foraging areas. She hinted at pulling out entirely but could not bring herself to relinquish the land her family had tended for generations. Jason listened to these developments in stoic silence. That same day, he caught sight of Chandler's SUV passing near his property at dusk, headlights cutting across the fields in slow arcs. With purposeful calm, Jason loaded a few essential items into his own battered pickup, anticipating that he would drive out before nightfall. He wanted to be present at the large ranch, not so much to speak, but to bear witness, to ensure that those who refused to be coerced would not stand alone. He sensed that a confrontation was inevitable, though he had no illusions about single-handedly halting corporate machinery through force. Instead, he recalled the discipline and composure he had once used to manage complicated film productions under extreme pressure. That reservoir of focus and readiness would have to suffice. As evening descended, the sky shed its muted pinks in favor of deepening purples, and a chill wind swept through the valley, carrying the promise of another round of rain. Jason started his truck and navigated the winding roads that led to the far side of Hollow Glen. The entire landscape felt subdued, as if animals and people alike were hunkered down, waiting for a final outcome. On the approach to the designated ranch, he saw multiple vehicles parked along the dirt roadway. Some were old pickups with local plates, others were sleek SUVs that likely belonged to corporate representatives. A cluster of horses stood tethered to a fence, watched over by ranch hands who carried attention in their posture. In the distance, the main ranch house stood illuminated by a line of tall floodlights, casting stark shadows across the yard. He parked some distance away to avoid drawing attention. From this vantage point, he observed small knots of people gathered near an open-sided barn. The orchard owner and the beekeeping neighbor were both present, joined by several other landowners who clutched sheaves of paperwork. A separate group, wearing polished footwear and carrying laptops, occupied another corner, presumably Fox's team. Near the edge of the floodlight's glow, Trent Chandler loomed, arms folded, posture stiff. Jason could not see Fox himself, but he surmised the man might be inside the ranch house, conferring with officials or orchestrating the last steps of a plan meant to consolidate near total control. The tension in the air was near unbearable. A hush fell as a tall figure emerged from the barn's interior, beckoning the orchard owner and another local forward. Papers were exchanged, and subdued statements were delivered, none audible from Jason's vantage point. The orchard owner appeared resolute, though her shoulders revealed the weight pressing down on her. Another orchard caretaker who had accompanied her whispered something while passing a set of documents. Nearby, the beekeeping neighbor stood with hands clasped, clearly torn between the primal urge to fight and the practical reality that an unfavorable signature might be forced on her. A representative from the county hovered to one side, clearly unenthusiastic about his role in the proceedings, but bound by legal obligations. A cloud swept over the floodlights, creating a momentary gloom, and that was when Jason glimpsed a figure stepping into view near the ranch house porch. Even from a distance, the man carried himself with casual authority, wearing an impeccably tailored coat that suggested affluence. A slight tilt of his head and the purposeful stride confirmed suspicions. This was Graham Fox. He paused to speak briefly with Chandler, who then moved deeper into the gathered crowd, as though to announce the arrival of the man behind the entire operation. Although no direct words were audible from Jason's position, he felt the ripple of reaction from the local families. Their backs stiffened, eyes darting nervously, as if acknowledging the presence of a figure who held disproportionate sway over their livelihoods. For an agonizing interval, nothing happened. The orchard owner stood firm at the barn's threshold, hugging her papers to her chest. A tall rancher with weather-beaten features moved closer, possibly offering moral support. Jason noticed an older farmer stepping forward, his tremulous hand clutching a set of deeds. This farmer appeared to be making a last-ditch plea, maybe hoping that the corporation would relent or grant fairer terms. Fox, from his vantage point at the porch, regarded the scene without haste, occasionally conferring with a subordinate who carried a thick binder. The corporate side seemed well prepared, while the locals looked exhausted, their defiance tempered by weeks of stress. It was a tableau that captured the entire conflict in microcosm, a slow, inevitable march toward capitulation, overshadowed by an unyielding corporate interest. Jason weighed the option of stepping forward to stand visibly beside the orchard owner and the beekeeping neighbor. Yet he remained in the background for a short while longer, gauging the situation. Then came a stirring near the line of trucks, as more landowners arrived with expressions that were neither hopeful nor resigned but determined, as though they had made up their minds to resist. Word must have spread through the valley that this was the night everything would be decided. A new wave of people joined the orchard owner, forming a silent cluster of families who had not yet succumbed to fear. The orchard caretaker assisted in organizing them. Tension escalated with each new arrival. Chandler hovered at the edge, looking unsettled by the sudden unity on display. Moments later, Fox made a slight motion with his hand. A member of his administrative team approached the orchard owner and spoke in a hushed tone, gesturing at the papers in her grasp. The orchard owner shook her head with deliberate clarity, apparently refusing the terms. A current of subdued alarm pulsed through the corporate representatives, who seemed unaccustomed to direct refusals at this final stage. Another official stepped forward to address the orchard owner with typed sheets in hand, pointing at sections that presumably summarized all the reasons she should comply. Jason thought he detected a tremor in the orchard owner's stance, yet she did not yield ground. People around her closed ranks, forging a wordless coalition. In that instant, the ranch yard fell so silent that even the shuffle of boots on gravel sounded thunderous. Chandler, evidently sensing that the negotiations were stalling, strode toward the orchard owner's group. His posture radiated controlled aggression. He spoke a few tense remarks that reached no ears beyond the circle around him, though from the orchard owner's expression, Jason deduced that she had just been threatened, possibly with immediate legal or physical consequences. The orchard caretaker raised a steadying hand, urging calm. Others exchanged resolute glances, as if drawing upon a shared will. No one retreated. That was when Jason stepped forward, closing the distance until he stood at the edge of the orchard owner's cluster, letting Chandler see him clearly. He carried no visible weapon, showed no signs of hostility, but his presence alone signaled that the orchard owner and her allies were not isolated. A flicker of recognition crossed Chandler's face, as if recalling the glances shared at the county meeting. For a moment, a standstill reigned, no direct confrontation, just two sides lined up beneath the unsteady glow of the floodlights and an overcast sky. Fox observed from the porch, quietly weighing whether to intervene himself. The local families pressed closer together. Their combined number was larger than any single property dispute suggested. Jason, standing tall beside the orchard owner and the beekeeping neighbor, gave no outward signal or speech. Yet everything about his stance conveyed a refusal to accept the corporation's manipulations. Others mirrored that silent determination, forming a line that seemed, in its own understated way, unbreakable. Hours might have passed in that standoff, though it likely lasted only minutes. Eventually, Fox made a slight, dismissive gesture, prompting his associates to withdraw a few steps. The orchard owner exhaled, relief mingled with lingering wariness. Chandler, still tense, watched the growing crowd of dissenting locals with an air of resentment. One of Fox's suited aides gathered some documents from a portable desk set up in the barn, possibly realizing that a straightforward capitulation was not forthcoming. No final, cinematic clash erupted that night. Instead, a heavy impasse settled over the ranch yard. It became clear to both sides that pressing further risks, whether legal or physical, would provoke an immediate backlash from a community that had found a kernel of unity. While nobody fully believed they had triumphed, the locals recognized a momentary shift in their favor. Fox, after a brief consultation with his team, stepped away from the porch and disappeared into the main house, leaving the subtle message that negotiations would be paused. As the floodlights buzzed overhead, families quietly departed, heading back to their vehicles. The orchard owner clutched her papers, expression both defiant and uncertain, yet she found time to thank those who had stood beside her, if only through a nod or clasp of hands. The caretaker walked with her, shoulders squared, refusing to show fear. Jason made the drive home under a cold drizzle that began soon after the confrontation dispersed. His thoughts felt tangled with a mix of relief and apprehension. A line had been drawn, but the matter was far from settled. The corporation was unlikely to abandon its designs simply because of a single standoff. Yet something had changed in the hearts of Hollow Glen's residents. They had witnessed that they were not alone, that the power of intimidation wavered when confronted by unified resolve. Jason recognized that the next steps would be complicated and that the corporate players would adapt tactics, possibly using more subtle legal channels. Even so, the community had found a glimmer of hope that might grow if they fortified it with collective will. In the days that followed, Fox's employees departed the valley in increments, concluding their immediate errands. Chandler lingered at a local motel for a short while, perhaps monitoring the situation or tying up loose ends, but he eventually vanished as well. County officials circulated new bulletins stating that adjustments to the reservoir plan were pending further review, which fueled speculation that Fox was delaying legal processes rather than giving up. Yet despite the uncertainty, Hollow Glen breathed easier. Families who had once viewed each other with caution began to share resources more openly, pooling expertise, equipment, and advice. The orchard owner resumed her daily chores, showing no sign of leaving. The beekeeping neighbor reported that her hives were recovering, bolstered by a renewed sense of stability. Discussions in the feed store and diner turned more optimistic, if still guarded. Jason embraced the subtle transformation of the valley. He carried on with his planting schedule, paying close attention to the sprouting rows behind his barn. He spent time repairing the roof of the old storage shed, feeling the warmth of the sun on his back as he hammered new planks into place. When the orchard owner passed by with a wave, he reciprocated with a brief nod, an acknowledgement of a bond forged in silent defiance. Their shared experiences had peeled away the lingering veneer of anonymity he once cultivated. He understood that by standing with Hollow Glen's residents, he had committed himself to their future, no longer a lone newcomer but a part of the valley's tapestry. Summer arrived with abundant sunshine and the promise of a good growing season. Local families rotated chores in a cooperative spirit, caring for each other's animals and sharing irrigation water whenever possible. Some older farmers speculated that Fox or Chandler might return in the fall, yet they steeled themselves with the memory of that night at the ranch. If further legal battles ensued, they intended to fight them with collective backing. A quiet determination spread through Hollow Glen, fueled by an undercurrent of solidarity. While the corporation's ambition cast a lingering shadow, the valley now had a chance to assert its rights, guided not by fear but by the simple, unspoken pact that neighbors would not stand apart when threatened. One bright morning, Jason walked his property line at dawn, savoring the crisp air that was already carrying traces of warmth. Sunlight fell on the newly grown shoots in the main field, painting the horizon in gentle shades of gold. He paused at the edge of the creek, listening to the water's easy flow. In that moment, the memories of red carpets and film sets seemed worlds away, overshadowed by the tangible reality of this land and the resolve of those who worked it. The orchard, the hives, the ranchers, the feed store, and the quiet homesteads hidden in hollow glens winding roads, these had become his community, however unexpected. He gazed at the boundary fence and recalled the tension that had nearly consumed the valley, acknowledging that the danger was not gone, only held at bay. Yet for now, the day blossomed with the simple hope of steady growth and hard-won unity. He lingered by the creek, feeling the gentle push of the breeze against him, a living counterpart to the intangible storms that had swept through his life. Somewhere beyond the hills, Fox might still plan his return, and the future might hold further tests of strength, but Hollow Glen had discovered something more enduring than any corporation's design. Jason turned away from the fence, walking back toward the farmhouse and the tasks awaiting him, each step an affirmation that, despite the challenges and the weight of past burdens, he had found a purpose worth defending in the heart of farmland he had once called his escape. Now it was simply home, and he intended to stand by it, quietly. Firmly, without regret. Imagined.